All right, so today we're going to be making a watercolor snow globe on a little piece of paper that's going to be like a card. So you can use a full sheet of watercolor paper, or I'm doing it on 9x12 watercolor paper that I've then cut in half and then cut that in half, so it's close to a 4x6 size. So I have a roll of tape to use as my circle. You could also freehand your circle if you want to. And I have a picture of a snow globe, but I'm mainly going to be inspired by this and kind of make my own version of it. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to be tracing the inside of the tape. Now, if I was doing a larger piece of paper, I could probably do the outside to make a larger circle. It kind of depends how small you want it to be. So after I have my nice pretty circle, then I'm going to do the stand that goes around it. Now you can see, you can't really see the bottom of the circle when the stand is on there. So I like to kind of turn my paper when I'm trying to draw ellipses, and I would lightly do like a really skinny ellipse. And then from there, I'll do 2 side angles and a curve at the bottom to start my stand. And then I drew my pencil really lightly just so that I can now erase. And it looks like my stand is a little sideways. So now I'm going to try and make this side the same height as the other side. And then next, we're going to talk about how to start drawing the stuff inside your snow globe. Okay, so now that we have our snow globe shape, we're going to go ahead and start putting what's inside the snow globe. Now, one part that gives you the illusion that, you know, there's snow building up is kind of this edge in here. And we're just going to paint that a little bit darker and leave some of this snow, just the white of the paper. So you could draw in that just so you don't lose track of where that's going to go, or I may just paint it in. I am going to draw in though my snowman, and you can see how, you know, they're circles, but they're not perfect circles. Like they're a little more squished. So I'll start with the bottom circle, which I'm just going to lightly say, okay, this is my snow. And I'm going to start with the bottom circle, which is more like kind of an ovally egg shape. And then I would recommend like putting a little line for where you want the top of your snowman to end, so you don't end up drawing the sections and running out of room. And then I'm going to overlap my medium section with the large section, and then have his circular head. And then his scarf is going to also curve around his neck. So I have it curved right here. And I have another curve wrapping around his neck. And then 2 bands going down. And then his hat is the tricky part because, you know, you don't have to do a hat or this hat. You could do a totally different hat. Or he could be a bald snowman. That's perfectly fine. So, but if I wanted to do a hat like that, I would have it on a slight tilt like that. And then I'll wrap one side. So kind of having like a little curve. So it looks like it goes behind his head. And then have a little top hat. All right, so now that we have our snowman lightly drawn out, I'm not gonna draw in the face or the mouth, anything like that, because I'm gonna do that later with a Sharpie or with paint. So I'm not worried about that right now. And next what we're gonna do is start shading our snowman. So I have my watercolor palette, and we're mainly gonna be using Payne's Gray and Ultramarine Blue. So I'm taking a number 6 brush, just like a little round brush. If you're painting a bigger snowman, smaller snowman, adjust accordingly. And I'm gonna take water first, a little bit of Payne's Gray, and I'm gonna make a nice light little puddle. And then I'm gonna wash off my paintbrush and make a puddle of ultramarine blue. Now, if you have a different blue you like, I really like ultramarine blue for shadows and snow, just because it's very soft, unlike phthalo blue, which is kind of more of a tealy green blue. And what I'm gonna start with first is shading my snowman. So what I mean by shading is I'm gonna have my light source be coming from the left-hand side. So then on the right-hand side is gonna be my shadows. So for that, I can use just water on one side. And then I'll use my ultramarine blue with the same brush, and I can underline one section of the snowman and then go slightly to the side. Now, you don't want to freak out if you have it kind of blossoming and blooming, because snow is not perfectly smooth. I can smooth it out a little bit by taking my paintbrush and kind of tapping it with the water. Not very much water though, because if you have too much water, it'll just all blossom everywhere. And then I'll do that for the next two sections. So I'm doing a little bit of water, just so it's slightly shiny. Underlining. Oh, and that one bled a little bit, but that's okay. I'll bring it down more. And if it really bleeds, like let's say this whole thing turned blue, I can always take a Kleenex or a paper towel and lift my highlight side and I'll get it bright again. And then the last one's gonna be the face, which it's gonna be shaded underneath the hat and to one side. And then I would let this dry for a little bit before we do the next step, just because if you try and start painting your background while this is wet, it's all gonna bleed in. All right, so now that my snowman is a little bit drier, now if yours is still really wet, you could always blow dry it or work on a different watercolor while you're doing that. That's a lot of times while I have multiple projects going on. But since I have this ultramarine blue out still, I can use this to start creating a little more dimension inside my snow globe. So I can use just ultramarine blue to create the edge where the snow is kind of building up. And I'm gonna drag it with a little bit of water. So this is kind of like snow that's in shadow because it's piled up. And then what I'll do with my ultramarine blue is I can start creating, because right now you can't really see that this back here is snow. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to fill my snow globe with this ultramarine blue, and this is wet on dry because I'm kind of doing it a section at a time. And I'm gonna go all the way up to my snowman with the ultramarine blue, but I'm gonna try and leave some little sections that are like highlights. So like on the very edge right here, I've left that white on purpose because then I'm just gonna take a little water and soften it. So it's kind of like a little more hazy. And I'll keep going and doing the same thing. If you're worried about it drying before you can get over to the next section, you can always wet a section at a time instead, just to get it to spread. But a lot of times I just kind of overlap it. And if it's not consistent, that's okay, because we're gonna put snow in here anyway. So I'm gonna keep filling and filling over here. And then on this one, I'm gonna do something a little different on this side, because I'm gonna fill this whole thing with the blue, except for a little curved highlight. And I'm gonna go around the hat. Now, if you're worried about it being really patchy, a lot of times with your paintbrush, you want to try and use very few brush strokes or overlap your brush strokes. Because if I have too many brush strokes, then it looks really messy. But that's okay, because sometimes it's pretty when a watercolor is messy. There you go. And then I'm going to let that layer dry. I can kind of soften where the snow meets that blue. And then we'll do details later. And then next, what I want to do on my snowman, so this area is now dry. So what I can do next is start painting on his hat and his scarf. So for the hat, you can make it whatever color you want. I'm going to go for more of a black hat. So I'm going to take Payne's Gray, and you can keep this separate from a Payne's Gray pile or just mix some more later. And then I'm going to add some brown, which could be Van Dyke brown or burnt sienna, to my Payne's Gray to make it darker. It also helps to neutralize it a little bit so it's closer to black. And then what I'm going to do with that color is I'm going to go ahead and paint the entire hat.
Payne's Gray and burnt sienna?
Uh-huh. And then after I've painted the entire hat, if it's super wet, you can let it dry. Or sometimes if it's just like a touch wet, I can use that opportunity to do another layer on one side for like a shadow on the hat. So I'm going to drop in on this side. And the other little details where it's darker, I'll probably wait for it to dry. And then I can do the same thing on my scarf, but with like a different color. Like I could do cadmium red if I want a really bright scarf. I could do a blue scarf and then do red stripes on it later. But for now, I'm just gonna fill it in with a red while my hat is drying. Now, if you start filling it in and you notice there's like a really big puddle, it can be that you're using too much water or that you have just too big of a brush for the space you're trying to fill in. But a lot of times if I just tap off my brush, then it kind of fixes the situation. And I'm filling in with the tip of my brush these sides. And then for the little fringe on the scarf, I'm going to flick to create the little trails. And I'll have to wait for it to dry to separate the scarf. Now that my hat and scarf are a little bit drier, I can now go back in with a smaller brush. This is like a 2. And what I want to do is darken kind of underneath the brim of the hat. Like that, and that adds a little bit of 3-dimensionalness to the hat. I'm going to bring this that way. I could also put a little more right here. Right here. And then if it gets starts bleeding into the face of the snowman, I can always use like a slightly wet brush to try and lift it a little bit. It may make the top of the head a little gray, but that's okay. We can pretend it's another shadow right there. And then for the scarf, so since I did red, I could take red and add a little bit of a blue, like ultramarine blue, to make a darker red. And I could use that to go on the bottom of the scarf, but also to go to one side of the scarf, like to kind of separate those two sections with a little bit of water. And I'm going to use a little water to blend this part in. Oops. And if he turns a little pink, that's okay. You can always lift it or leave it you know, white things tend to reflect things that are around them. And then we'll let those two things dry. And another thing you can do while those are drying is you could do a little bit of a shadow with that same gray, kind of watered down to one side of the snowman. So like underneath my snowman and then to the side. So that was just basically my Payne's gray. And then I'll use a little bit of water to soften the edges like that. So next, I can start filling in the base of my snow globe just to let everything dry. Now, it's up to you what color you want to do the base. I think I'm going to do like a brown, and I'm going to make like a darker brown using burnt sienna and Payne's gray mixed together. See, like that. And I'm going to do kind of the same thing I did with my hat, where, oh, this is already warping. If you have it where your paper's warping and it's making it hard to work on, that's a lot of times why we tape our watercolor paper. Now, I'm not too bothered by that, so I can always put water on the back once I'm done with the painting and then let it dry and then put it between some books, and it kind of just equals it out. So right now, I just kind of have to push down the watercolor paper, and I'm just gonna do kind of a base layer. And I'm gonna turn it so I can get a better angle. Now, and as I go over to the edge, if I wanted to try and put in a little bit of shading, I could always use a little water to spread the brown as I go over. So then it just gets a little bit lighter. So, and then I can let that dry before I add more detail, or I could even just leave it like that. Another thing you could do is, like, if you have metallic watercolor, you could always do a glaze on top of it if you wanted it to be shiny. And if I wanted it to be like pure gold, I could have done yellow ochre, which is kind of like a Dijon kind of yellow. It's like, you know, goldy, and then done the metallics on top. So we're gonna let this dry, and then after that, I'll probably start working on the snow inside the snow globe and some details on the face. I have this brown on my palette. I could also go ahead and do his little stick arms, or you could always use like a brown Sharpie if you want to do that instead, but I find sometimes the brown Sharpie is very dark. So I'm gonna go from a little bit inside my snowman and then go out, and normally I'll give them like, you know, 2 fingers or sometimes 3, you know, depending. You could also give them like actual hands if you want to. And then on my other one, it's actually going to come from behind the scarf, and I'm going to give this one 3. So what we're gonna do lastly or nextly is a face. So for the face of the snowman, I would recommend painting the nose first, and I would use like a bright yellow, like a lemon yellow, and add a little bit of your cadmium red to it. If you have an orange, you could just use that. And normally it's a little more interesting to have the nose kind of going off to the side. And then I could always come back and do like a little bit of burnt sienna underneath on the nose for a bit of a shadow. And then for the rest of the face, you could use Sharpie or watercolor. Now, that's up to you, what you feel you have better control with. With the watercolor, I would mix my Payne's gray and like burnt umber to make it really, really dark, like a black. And for the eyes, I'm just gonna do little circles. Oops. But they don't have to be perfect because they're coal. Coal can be different. And then I'm gonna give mine a very big grin. There you go. And then I wanna do little buttons that are slightly to the side, so they're not like exactly straight since he's kind of turned slightly. And then the very last thing I would do is putting snow in your snow globe. Now, if this was way too light, I could use my Payne's Gray to do some shadows in here before I do the snow, like putting a little bit of darker and then putting in a little water to blend it. And that just adds an extra amount of depth in the snow globe, but you don't necessarily have to do that. And then I would use either white acrylic or white gouache, and you could flick little white dots. Or if I want a little more control over it, you can use like a paint marker, which I think I used red with this because now my snow is slightly pink, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about it. And I'll just do lots and lots of little dots. And you want it to kind of overlap on your snowman so it feels like he's in the snow globe. And then if you wanted this to look more three-dimensional, then you could do a little shadow underneath the snow globe and things like that. But that's generally how to make a snow globe.